Now, Corinna, you don't strike me as the type, but you have to. Have you ever tried to brew anything at home, alcohol-wise?
No.
Cup of tea?
Yeah, that's about my level.
For those who think the master brewers, the process from hops to Hefeweizen usually takes about 1 to 2 months. But how about a 5,000-year-old beer? Well, kind of. Scientists in Israel have resurrected ancient strains of yeast collected from clay pots. They were handed to craft brewers and they turned it into this. Scientists say it's an important step in experimental archaeology, a field that seeks to reconstruct the past and better understand the flavours of the ancient world. Let's bring in the beer writer, educator and enthusiast, Matt Kierkegaard. He's based in Brisbane. He's also the founder of Brews News. Matt Kierkegaard, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
There's something quite biblical about this story, isn't it? Yeast revived from the Holy Land before the times of Christ, dating back to the days of the pharaohs. How did they do it?
Well, they found some shards and they were able to find the yeast that was still in the shards of the pot that was once used to brew beer. And the miracle is they were able to resurrect that yeast and get it brewing again.
How did the yeast survive that long? Because yeast can be quite delicate and temperamental.
Well, yeast can, but it's essentially a single-cell fungus, and we've been able to recover previously yeast from bottles of beer that had been found in shipwrecks that were 200 or 300 years old. They've just managed to find that yeast can last even longer than that.
How does anyone bring yeast back to life when it's 5,000 years old?
Very carefully. Now, I don't know the full science behind bringing the yeast back, but I'd imagine that they recovered the yeast and then were able to coax it back from dormancy using sugars, I'd imagine, to get it fermenting again.
So how significant is it that this particular sample is derived from an ancient source? Is it not the case that, you know, yeast is yeast is yeast?
Well, yeast is millions of years old, so it's hundreds of millions of years old. So there's nothing spectacular about old yeast. I guess the fact that we're able to commune with beers that were drunk 5,000 years ago is quite interesting. Over the last 100, 150 years, since we've had better technology, brewers have been able to use that technology to refine their yeasts, and some of the wild yeast that still exist can give a fairly funky flavour in beer, and so brewers have gradually tried to eliminate that by choosing yeast strains. To go back and resurrect this yeast and use it in brewing gives us an idea of what some of the yeast characters that would have been available to brewers back 5,000 years ago.
I have to say, I like how one of the researchers described sitting down to their first drink and saying either we'll be good or we'll be dead in 5 minutes, and another one said the beer isn't bad, which isn't exactly a ringing endorsement. Have you been able to get an idea of what it tastes like?
Look, I've not been fortunate enough to try the beer yet, but from the descriptions that I've read, the beer that they've made is using modern techniques for the grain and the water and the brewing process. So the really interesting thing is the flavours that the yeast bring. And there are modern beers that come from Belgium that are called spontaneous ferment, where they still use wild yeasts. And some of the characteristics used to describe them are wet dog, horse blanket and farmyard. So I'm imagining when they were talking about funky, they were some of the flavours that the wild yeast that they used may have brought to the beer. But then again, when you're talking in the world of cheese, if you're having a nice supermarket cheddar cheese, that's a fairly clean flavour. And then you can get some fairly interesting flavours when you start getting into the Roqueforts and Stilton. So I think in the beer world, we're looking at something that's more equivalent to some of those gamier cheeses.
How much does our beer today, particularly what's commercially available, resemble what they were drinking 5,000 years ago?
Oh, look, what we're drinking today is vastly different. The beers that we're drinking today are the high art of food science. The brewers back then were using very rudimentary techniques. They wouldn't have even known what yeast was. We haven't known what yeast was until recently. And even in the medieval times, monks used to call the fermentation process and the growth that occurred on the top of the fermentation, God is good. So if you go back 5,000 years ago, the beer tended to be, they would bake bread first and then they would wet the bread, and so the fermenting vessel was a fairly, was quite a cocktail, and the beer drinkers would drink through straws. They would punch the straw down through the cruft that sat on top and drink the beer. So it was a very communal experience, but it was vastly different from what we experience today when we go down and have a shout.
And the practices were quite different too. The beer was fermented in the sun, they sometimes used fruit, and it could be quite strong as well, up around 6%.
Yes, so that was quite surprising that the yeast fermented that high. And I guess when you go back and read the ancient hieroglyphs, there were different names that they had for beer. They had Friends beer, they had Iron beer. So each of the beers had its own property and they had their own marketing terms. So it's interesting to see what they were able to come up with when they used the yeast in some of the modern techniques.
Now, the researchers behind this are hoping to make this beer commercially available one day. I can already think of the many marketing slogans to come: Bethlehem Brew, Lazarus Lager, Pharaoh's Fizz. I imagine it's going to get a pretty good reception if and when it does hit the shops.
Oh, look, I think so as well. It's there's going to be some great names, and you know, I tend to think of you know, the biblical story of Jesus, where his first miracle was turning water into wine, and I've heard it said that his first miracle was turning water into wine because making beer was a little bit too hard for a beginner. So maybe there's something that they can riff on there.
Now, in a similar vein, there's been news in the past couple of days of monks at a monastery in Belgium, north of Brussels, brewing beer again based on a recipe that's very old.
Yes, apparently the monks of Grimbergen dug through their records and found an ancient version of, an older version of their beer. The beer has been available under the Grimbergen name for quite some time, and it's been brewed by the modern brewer Carlsberg. And so they've never been able to call it a Trappist beer or a monastic beer, which has very certain strict rules around it. But they've been able to license the Abbey's name and make an Abbey beer that is quite commercially available. And it sounds like the Carlsberg company has gone and offered to work with the monks to set up a brewery that will be making a fairly small run that follows that tradition. And it's really to give the commercially available beer that they've been making for some time a bit of a halo effect and a bit of a, as you said, a marketing angle that they can use to get it to new audiences.
Well, as you say, there are particular rules in the Trappist brewing tradition. What do those rules involve?
Well, the beer needs to be made within the walls of the monastery. It needs to be made with the active participation of the monks, and it also needs to be done for charitable purposes. So it can't be done commercially. And I think there's 12 monastic breweries currently brewing along those rules. So this is one that any of the sales from this beer will need to be used for charitable purposes. But it certainly gives their commercially made beer under license a nice story to tell as well.
It'll be strong, 10.8%, so it's definitely not for the faint-hearted.
Definitely not for the faint-hearted, and it was described by the monks of the Middle Ages as liquid bread, and it got them through the fasting period of Lent. And that's one of the nice synergies between the old yeast story and this story, is that the ancient hieroglyph for food was bread and beer, and pretty much the monks still see it the same way.
Matt Kierkegaard, thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.